Welcome back to Whispers in the Cellar, the place where forgotten truths are unearthed and the past refuses to stay buried. Tonight, we follow the frost-bitten footsteps of a story almost erased from memory. A chapel sealed in silence, a staircase that shouldn't exist, and a room beneath it all that was never meant to be opened. But something opened it anyway. And what came out is still looking for warmth. Let's begin. In January of 1861, in the coastal town of Harpswell, Maine, a maintenance crew was dispatched to assess storm damage at the long-abandoned Whitlock House for Wayward Children. The old orphanage sat perched on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its gray clapboard siding beaten raw by decades of salt wind. Locals had long since stopped asking questions about the place. It had closed its doors in 1858 under vague claims of reorganization and relocation, and in a town that survived on fishing, not rumors, no one pressed for details. But the nor'easter that tore through Cumberland County that winter left more than just toppled chimneys and flooded fields. It exposed something. A cracked foundation wall on the orphanage's eastern wing revealed a passage, previously sealed, behind what appeared to be layered stone and mortar. The crew, 3 men from Brunswick contracted by the parish, pried the stone loose expecting rats or rot. What they found instead made one of them drop his lantern and run. A thick iron door, rusted but intact, sat recessed behind the wall. Weld marks along the edges told a story. This door hadn't been shut. It had been buried, bolted from the outside. The lead foreman, Patrick Donnelly, later told authorities he felt an immediate drop in temperature when he touched the metal. Like it wasn't just cold from the winter, he said. Like the cold was alive in there. They unbolted the door just after noon. It took 3 men and a crowbar. What lay behind it was a stone stairwell descending into pitch darkness. At the bottom, a room, a chamber carved into the bedrock, a place that should never have existed. They found 38 children. Most were alive. Some were not. The children were chained to the walls, iron cuffs locked around their ankles, connected by lengths of corroded chain to bolts sunk deep into the stone. The smell, even in the freezing air, was immediate and suffocating. Human waste, spoiled food, blood. But worse than the stench was the silence. Most of the children didn't speak. They didn't cry. They just stared. Their eyes were glassy, their skin blue at the fingertips. They wore little more than burlap and wool scraps, and some had no clothing at all. Half the room had frozen corpses, knees curled into chests, eyes open, frozen in expressions that still looked afraid. But those still breathing, when asked who did this to them, whispered only one name: Sister Agnes. The Harpswell Sheriff's Office received the report just before dusk. By morning, a unit of militia and church officials were on site. No one had ever documented such a room on the property's blueprints. The chamber beneath the eastern wing had no ventilation, no heating, and only a small hatch door leading to a defunct ice chute. That's when the second discovery was made. Behind the initial chamber was another, smaller space. It appeared to have been used as storage. Wooden crates, empty sacks of flour, rusted tin cans, and broken tools. But along one wall stood what looked like a crude altar, and nailed to the wall above it, a wooden crucifix painted black upside down. On the altar was a ledger, faded, water-damaged, but still legible. It listed names, dozens of them, some with a cross marked beside them. Others labeled returned or transferred. At the bottom of one page, in neat, looping script, someone had written, "The unclean must freeze before they are warmed." The children were taken to the parish hospital in Portland. Several were too weak to survive the journey. Those who did had injuries consistent with long-term restraint, exposure to extreme cold, and malnourishment. 2 had lost fingers to frostbite. One girl, age unknown, would not stop repeating a phrase, "He watches through the ice." Authorities tried to locate next of kin, but records were sparse. Most of the names in the ledger had no surnames, just first names, ages, and vague notes, difficult, defiant, marked. By the end of that week, word had reached Boston. The Archdiocese released a brief statement expressing sorrow over the tragic misuse of church property and announced an internal inquiry. But locals knew what that meant. There would be no trial, no testimony, only silence. The town of Harpswell fell quiet again, but the questions didn't. How had this gone unnoticed for years? Why had the orphanage truly closed in 1858? And who was Sister Agnes Whitlock, the woman the children still feared even after rescue? There were rumors, of course, that she had once lived in a convent in Salem before being reassigned after some incident. That the Whitlock House had taken in children other orphanages refused. That the priest who oversaw the orphanage's funding quietly resigned in the same month the basement was sealed. But no answers ever came. Only that room, only that door, and 38 children who would never forget what they were made to endure beneath the house on the bluff. Not from heat, not from disease, but from the cold, the kind that isn't just felt on the skin, the kind that settles in the soul and refuses to leave. Harpswell, Maine in 1861 was not the sort of place where anything truly remarkable ever happened. A slender peninsula jutting into Casco Bay, it was a town of slate-gray waters, lobster traps, seaweed-choked docks, and quiet men who mended their nets by oil lamp. The kind of town where everyone knew who'd been baptized, who'd been buried, and who missed Mass last Sunday. At its peak, Harpswell had just under 400 residents. Most were fishermen, shipbuilders, or the widows of those who never returned from the sea. There was one schoolhouse, 2 churches, and a general store that also served as the post office, a barber shop, and, occasionally, a mortuary. Gossip traveled fast, but not always far, and when it brushed too close to anything sacred, it was often swept under the rug. That's how the Whitlock House for Wayward Children came to sit so quietly on the edge of that town for nearly a decade, cloaked not in secrecy, but in reverence. To the townspeople, the orphanage was a symbol of grace. It had been established in 1850 with funds raised by the First Order of St. Agatha, a Boston-based religious charity. The stone plaque above the arched entrance read, "A refuge for the forgotten." It had an attached chapel, a vegetable garden, and a bell that chimed twice daily for prayer and meals. Sister Agnes Whitlock, its founder and headmistress, had arrived from Massachusetts with 2 other nuns and a wagon load of second-hand furniture and hymnals. She was, by most accounts, an imposing woman, tall, always in black, with a voice that never rose in anger and never dipped in affection. Her presence quieted rooms, but she was respected. When Sister Agnes came to town for supplies, she walked with her hands folded. She answered every greeting with a polite smile and a blessing. She bought flour and soap in bulk, asked few questions, and never lingered. On the rare occasion that she attended Sunday service at St. Elijah's, the townsfolk made space for her in the front pew. Few questioned the nature of the Whitlock House's work. It was said that the orphanage took in children deemed unfit for the more refined homes in Boston: crippled boys, mute girls, those with difficult temperaments or foreign tongues. Sister Agnes explained that they were the bruised reeds, souls in need of firm but loving correction. Most nodded along. It wasn't a time for questioning nuns. There were, of course, glimpses, flickers, small things that, in hindsight, now reeked of rot. Mrs. Mallory, who ran the general store, remembered once seeing a boy in the back of the orphanage's supply wagon, staring wide-eyed and silent beneath a heavy wool blanket. His skin looked blotched. His eyes were swollen. "Oh, he's just had the fever," Sister Agnes explained. "We're isolating him to prevent spread." Father Llewellyn, the town priest, recalled offering to visit the orphanage to conduct Easter Mass. Sister Agnes had smiled and declined. "Our children are not ready to receive," she said softly. "They must first understand the weight of grace." Occasionally, smoke would be seen curling from the chimneys long after midnight. Strange melodies, hymns, but wrong somehow, drifted down the hills on windless nights. The children themselves were rarely seen. When they were, they didn't speak. In 1856, a winter fair was held in the churchyard and 5 children from Whitlock House were brought to sing a carol. They stood in mismatched clothes, eyes lowered, and sang in Latin, not joyfully, but with mechanical precision. When the song ended, one of them collapsed. She was carried off without explanation. The town applauded politely and said nothing. Why didn't anyone ask more questions? Some did. Dr. Eli Warren, the town's only physician, had visited the Whitlock House twice during its operation. Both times, he was refused entry beyond the infirmary. Sister Agnes would meet him at the door, describe the illness in careful detail, and accept his medicines with solemn thanks. When he asked to examine the child himself, she'd say, "Their condition is spiritual, doctor. Physical remedies are only half the cure." Dr. Warren admitted, years later, that he should have pressed harder. That something about the way her pupils dilated when she spoke about discipline unsettled him. But he had patience elsewhere, and she was, after all, a woman of God. The town accepted her explanations the same way it accepted harsh weather, sudden drownings, and stillbirths, not with joy, but with resignation. To challenge a nun, especially one running an orphanage, was to question Providence itself. In 1858, the Whitlock House abruptly closed. The official explanation came from a letter, posted to the town council and signed by Father Marcus Abner, a Boston cleric with oversight of the First Order. The letter stated that the property was under review, that funding had been temporarily suspended, and that the children had been relocated to more suitable facilities in Massachusetts. No one from Harpswell ever saw a wagon leave. No horses were hitched. No tearful goodbyes. It was as if the children had simply evaporated. For 3 years, the building sat empty. Weeds overtook the garden. The bell rope rotted away. Snow collapsed one wing's roof. And when boys from the town dared each other to sneak inside, they always came back pale, breathless, and shivering. "The walls whisper," one said. "Something's still in there." Most brushed it off. Just childhood fancy. Leftover trauma from ghost stories and winter storms. And then, on January 4th, 1861, the nor'easter came. The storm that ripped open the foundation and cracked the past wide apart. That was when the wall was found. The iron door, the staircase, and 38 children, buried in silence beneath the house no one wanted to look at too closely. Children who were supposed to have been relocated. Children who, for years, had cried beneath floorboards while the town went on baking bread, mending nets, and singing Christmas carols. Now the question was no longer what happened at the Whitlock House. The question was, how did we all let it happen? And what would be uncovered next? Because behind Sister Agnes's smile, there were more rooms and deeper lies. The first time Father Marcus Abner was asked about the Whitlock House, he responded with a carefully neutral smile. It was a charitable effort, he said, unfortunately marred by structural and financial limitations. That statement was given in February of 1861, a few weeks after the children were discovered beneath the orphanage floor. At the time, he stood behind a podium in a chapel in Boston, flanked by 2 bishops and a lawyer from the diocesan council. They did not mention the chains. They did not mention the frozen bodies. They certainly did not mention the phrase found etched into the stone altar: "They must freeze to be cleansed." The audience, made up of clergy and trusted press, accepted the statement without questions. The matter, as far as the church was concerned, was closed. But in Harpswell, the silence was only beginning to crack. Sheriff Allen Price, the first official to step into the stone cellar beneath the Whitlock House, had been in law enforcement for 23 years. He'd investigated murders, shipwrecks, suicides, and more drownings than he cared to count. But what he saw in that room still made his voice catch whenever he tried to describe it. What haunted him most wasn't the chains or the smell. It was the orderliness. It wasn't chaos, he wrote in his report. It was a system. It was planned, controlled. Someone made rules down there and followed them. That was the word that began to spread through town. System. Not accident, not neglect, not a few unfortunate children falling through the cracks. A system. One built brick by brick beneath a chapel. One protected by robes, rosaries, and forged signatures. One that had functioned, without interruption, for nearly a decade. The more authorities looked, the more rot they uncovered. When investigators returned to the orphanage with engineers and surveyors, they mapped the underground level. What they found contradicted every architectural record provided by the church. There were 3 chambers beneath the Whitlock House. The first, the holding room, was where the children had been found. The second, the so-called storeroom, contained crates, dried blood, shackles, and fragments of what were likely disciplinary tools: rods, ropes, and branding irons. The third room had no door. It was hidden behind a bricked-in wall. They broke through it on the 5th day of the investigation. Inside was a narrow corridor, barely wide enough to pass through sideways. It led to a small circular space no more than 10 feet across. The walls were lined with wooden shelves. On them, ledgers, stacks of them, organized by year. Inside each, names of children, dates of arrival, notes on temperament, compliance, resistance, and, most chillingly, recommendations. Some were labeled suitable for placement, others discipline needed, and some cold room. Authorities pored over these records for weeks. The earliest ledger was dated May 3, 1851, only 4 months after the orphanage first opened its doors. The entries were written in the same precise, looping script found on the altar inscription. Sister Agnes's hand. The ledger entries made one thing painfully clear. The children hadn't been neglected. They had been processed, categorized, evaluated. Each child had been assigned a condition score, marked from 1 to 5, with footnotes explaining their obedience, intelligence, and spiritual resistance. One particularly disturbing entry read, Name, Clara R., age 8. Origin, Fall River Workhouse. Behavior, defiant, speaks in sleep. Bit a nun. Disposition, cold room, minimum 6 weeks, reduce food. Observe silence. Pray at midnight, record progress. At the bottom, in ink darker than the rest. Stillness leads to salvation. But it wasn't just Sister Agnes who was implicated. In a locked drawer beneath the altar, investigators found a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. Most were addressed to Father Marcus Abner in Boston. The contents were unnervingly businesslike. Requests for additional funding. Updates on discipline outcomes. Referrals of difficult children from other facilities. One letter included a list of names of incoming orphans with estimated cost of care per head. The language was detached, almost clinical. 3 arrivals from Chelsea home. 2 are mute, 1 has burns, unclear temperament, advised placement or reduction. Another, cold room method proving effective. Increased compliance after 4th week. Recommend scaling procedure for incoming wave. The investigators circled the word scaling in red. What did that mean? Were there others? The answer came, like so much else in this case, quietly, through the side door. A retired nun named Sister Mary Ann Holtz visited the sheriff's office on February 17th. She'd once worked with Sister Agnes in Salem, she said. But after an incident involving fasting discipline that left a boy in a coma, she had been quietly transferred out of the order. She'd kept quiet for years out of fear, but when she read about the cellar in Harpswell, she couldn't hold her silence anymore. What she revealed sent investigators reeling. Sister Agnes, she claimed, had been part of a small circle of women within the First Order of St. Agatha who believed in spiritual purification through suffering. They viewed disobedience as a sign of demonic presence and saw pain, particularly silence and cold, as methods of sanctification. They didn't call it torture, she said. They called it cleansing. According to Sister Mary Ann, there were at least 3 other facilities that employed similar methods. 1 in Vermont, 1 in upstate New York, 1 rumored in a remote village in Quebec, all under the same religious umbrella, all with similar sealed records. They rotated the children, she whispered. If one started to speak up, they moved them. If one died, they erased the name. We weren't guardians, we were wardens. When asked why she didn't speak up sooner, she looked at her hands for a long time and said, "Because the world doesn't want to believe that women with crosses can be monsters." Her testimony broke the case wide open. Suddenly, the question wasn't just about Sister Agnes. It was about the church, about the towns that sent children away with blessings and blindfolds, about the men in robes who signed checks and locked drawers, and about the system, cold, methodical, and righteous, that operated beneath prayers, beneath charity, beneath the feet of a town too faithful to ask questions. A system that promised salvation, but delivered silence and ice. The snowstorm that tore through the coast of Maine on January 4th, 1861, brought more than just wind and wreckage. It brought the beginning of an unraveling. By the time the storm reached Harpswell, winds had reached 50 miles an hour, toppling chimneys and shearing the tops off the remaining trees. The sea foamed like boiling milk, and ice lashed sideways through the narrow streets like shattered glass. By dawn, the town was buried. Horses vanished beneath snowdrifts, windows cracked from pressure. The church bell froze mid-chime. But the Whitlock House was still standing. Barely. The collapse happened at first light. A third of the eastern wing caved inward with a sound like gunfire. Stone, timber, and slate giving way under the weight of ice and time. The old orphanage had been left to rot since its closure in 1858, but no one had expected it to die so suddenly. A local work crew, hired weeks earlier to inspect the crumbling foundation, had been due to begin repairs that very morning. They arrived late. By then, part of the roof was already inside the chapel. The workers moved carefully through the wreckage, stepping over beams and stained glass, still half buried in snow. What they found beneath the rubble wasn't what they were paid to fix. It was what they weren't supposed to see. The floorboards had cracked near the choir stalls, exposing a hollow space underneath. There was no smell, at least not at first, just the unmistakable chill of cold air rising from below, like an unseen breath. They found the first door beneath a warped beam, hidden behind a false wall. A thick sheet of iron, Its handle fused shut with rust. At first, the men assumed it was just a coal chute, an outdated part of the furnace system. Then one of them noticed scratch marks along the bottom edge of the metal, deep gouges clawed into the iron with desperate fingers. The youngest worker, Caleb Byrne, placed his ear against the cold metal out of curiosity. He heard crying, not loud, not recent, but layered, as if the iron itself remembered what had been sealed behind it. It took nearly an hour to remove the bolts. They pried the door open just after noon. The metal shrieked as it gave way. What followed was silence, then the sound of dripping water and the faint echo of chains dragging across stone. The chamber beneath had no light of its own. When lanterns were lowered, they revealed stairs descending into a man-made tunnel carved directly into the granite. The smell hit them halfway down. It wasn't death, not entirely. It was something worse, something old, fermented, human, a stench of rot and damp wool and frozen breath. The stone walls were sweating despite the cold. Muffled moans came from the darkness ahead. They found them in the main chamber, 38 children, most chained at the ankle. Some collapsed, some staring, all silent. The temperature was just above freezing. The walls had been sealed to insulate cold, not keep it out. There were barrels of snow packed against one corner, melting now, but clearly used to keep the chamber cold year-round. On the opposite wall, crude etchings, names, numbers, and one phrase repeated at least 7 times, "Stillness is holiness." The rescuers worked in near silence. They had no tools for what they were seeing. One man vomited in the stairwell, another broke down crying. Caleb, who had heard the voices behind the door, simply knelt beside a shivering boy and removed his coat, muttering, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I didn't know." News spread fast. Sheriff Alan Price arrived before dusk with Deputy Leland Knox and a medic from the Naval Yard in Brunswick. Within hours, makeshift stretchers were built from pews and floorboards. The children were lifted out one by one. Some flinched from the touch of daylight. Others passed out the moment they were unchained. A few, when carried into the open air, screamed for Sister Agnes not to punish them for leaving. By midnight, 12 of the children had been taken to Portland for emergency care. 3 died en route. Their bodies, it was later confirmed, showed signs of long-term restraint, starvation, frostbite, and in 2 cases blunt trauma to the skull. But none of them had been reported missing. Not by townspeople, not by distant relatives, not by the church, because the church, it seemed, had already decided they were gone. Back in Harpswell, Price ordered the building sealed and posted 2 deputies at the site overnight. The snowstorm had uncovered one secret. He was certain there were more, and he was right. 2 days later, while searching the wreckage for structural weaknesses, the work crew uncovered a second stairwell beneath the rear of the chapel. This one hidden beneath a piano, bolted to the floor from below. This passage led to a smaller, narrower room with a stone altar. The altar was stained black. Above it hung a crucifix, but upside down, and with nails driven through the palms of the wooden Christ. Etched into the wall in Latin were the words, Frigus purificat, Frigus dominatur. Cold purifies, cold dominates. Behind the altar, embedded in the wall, was a row of hooks. Hanging from them were 10 garments, simple wool habits, child-sized, covered in stitched markings and symbols that no one recognized. And in the corner, a ledger. It was bound in red leather, cracked from time and damp. Inside were lists, names, dates, notes, and something else. Formulas, mixtures of herbs, temperature logs, phrases like begin acclimation at 4 degrees, and compliance improves below freezing. One page bore only a single sentence, underlined twice. Pain is submission. Cold is obedience. When Father Llewellyn, the town's priest, was shown the room, he wept, not from grief, but from recognition. "I saw her writing once," he said. "Sister Agnes. She wrote like that, every letter, precise, like she was trying to impress God." He paused, then added, "Or control him." The evidence was overwhelming, but no arrests were made, because there was no one left to arrest. Sister Agnes Whitlock had vanished 3 years prior. According to church records, she had been reassigned to a convent in New Hampshire in 1858. But when Price contacted the convent, they denied ever receiving her. No forwarding record, no grave, no witness, only a signature in a transfer log, later proven to be forged. The last confirmed sighting of Sister Agnes Whitlock was April 12, 1858, 3 months after the orphanage closed, and just days after a final shipment of food and medicine had arrived. She had stood in the chapel doorway that morning, speaking softly to a group of children. Witnesses said she smiled and held out her hand. The children followed her down the stairs. She was never seen again, but her system, the rooms, the chains, the ledgers, the phrases, remained. And the ice cellar beneath the Whitlock House had done exactly what it was designed to do. Keep everything hidden. Keep everything cold, until the roof fell in. They say cold preserves the truth, that in the absence of decay, there can be no forgetting, only freezing. But what Sheriff Alan Price and his team uncovered beneath the Whitlock House wasn't truth preserved. It was pain suspended. A nightmare held in stasis, as if time itself had recoiled and refused to move forward. The cellar's main chamber was larger than expected, nearly 40 feet wide, oval-shaped, with stone walls that curved inward slightly, making the ceiling feel lower than it truly was. The floor was packed dirt, wet from years of condensation. Along the outer edges, metal rings had been driven deep into the granite foundation. Shackles dangled from each one, thick iron loops fastened by handmade chains. Most were still attached to small ankles. Some of the children had chewed the insides of their mouths raw. Others had bruises shaped like belt buckles. One boy had no toes. There was no bedding, only straw, thin piles of it, molded to the shapes of small, curled bodies. The few children who remained conscious recoiled at any touch. One of them, a girl estimated to be 10 or 11, begged for her chains to be put back on after the sheriff cut them. "She'll know," she whispered, her voice like splintered glass. "She always knows when someone's missing." That phrase would repeat again and again over the coming days. She, Sister Agnes. The children never called her mother or sister or headmistress, just she. As if her presence had gone beyond authority and become a kind of god, or a devil. Further back in the chamber, against the far wall, they found the bodies. 12 of them, arranged in a line, not buried, not even covered. Just placed there, side by side, as if laid out for inspection. Some had died recently, no more than a few weeks prior. Others were frozen stiff, preserved by the chamber's temperatures for years. Each child had their hands crossed neatly over their chest. A piece of parchment had been pinned to their clothing with small sewing needles. On each parchment, a single word: defiant, blasphemous, corrupted, unteachable. One word, repeated on 3 of the corpses, was especially chilling: returned. Returned to what? The forensic report would later confirm what the sheriff's team already suspected. Many of the children had died not from malnourishment or disease, but from exposure. Deliberate exposure. Their internal temperatures had dropped below survivable levels. Most had suffered from hypothermia, their skin covered in frostbite, lips split, eyes wide open as if frozen mid-scream. One boy, perhaps 9 years old, had burn marks across his back, signs of repeated contact with a heated metal object. The pattern matched one of the branding irons recovered from the adjacent chamber. It bore a symbol, a circle with an X inside it, later identified in one of the Whitlock ledgers as Mark of Resistance. The next chamber was even smaller, but in some ways worse. It was the adjustment room. In it, investigators found a single wooden chair, bolted to the floor. Leather straps at the wrists and ankles. A metal brace for the neck. Stains on the seat and the stone below. Along the wall, small cubbies containing tools, rods, clamps, cloth gags, a branding iron, and something that looked like a child-sized blindfold. Beneath the chair, carved into the floor, were 4 words. "Blessed are the still." In the corner, a rusted bucket. The smell confirmed its purpose. Sheriff Price refused to let any more children be brought into that room. It was never confirmed how long the adjustment procedures had taken place there, but among the ledgers found near the altar upstairs, one was labeled simply "Corrections." In it, 126 entries, each with a name, a date, a violation, and a note on outcome. Some examples: name, Eli J. Violation, refused morning prayer. Correction, isolation, 48 ERs, no heat. Result, began prayer on day 3. Name, Mercy W. Violation, screamed during hymn. Correction, gagged, ice immersion. Result, compliant, mute, transferred. Name, Thomas L. Violation, spoke to outsider. Correction, branding. Cold cell. Result, deceased. But perhaps the most disturbing document wasn't a ledger at all. It was a letter. Folded neatly inside the back cover of the corrections book was correspondence addressed to a Reverend Dr. Isaac Penmore, dated April 1857. The handwriting was unmistakably that of Sister Agnes. Reverend Penmore, the latest trials have produced satisfactory results. Exposure, when coupled with deprivation of speech and light, appears to recondition even the most unruly spirits. We begin with 2-hour immersions. Full obedience is usually achieved by day 6. Those who resist longer are marked and, if necessary, returned. We shall proceed with the next group by month's end. Please confirm the arrival of the new batch from Fall River. May they find stillness and frost. A. The letter confirmed what many feared. The children had not all come from Harpswell. They were brought in from other towns, other orphanages. Some likely purchased, others transferred under false pretenses. A network hidden behind scripture, soothed by hymns, and sealed in silence. When a reporter from the Boston Tribune attempted to gain access to the site days later, the church intervened. They issued a statement through Bishop Dalton of Portland, describing the discovery as a deeply troubling anomaly, and blaming a rogue sister acting without sanction or knowledge of the larger institution. But the town of Harpswell knew better. The community's hands were not clean. They had seen the wagon loads of food disappear into that house, had heard the cries in winter, had watched children look away in fear and said nothing. In the weeks following the discovery, a quiet guilt crept through the town like fog. Neighbors avoided eye contact. The chapel stood empty. The general store kept its lights dim. No one rang the church bell. And through it all, a single phrase continued to echo in the minds of the rescuers. Not shouted, not etched, whispered, by almost every child they tried to rescue. She said, if we speak, we'll freeze from the inside. Not metaphorically. literally. That was the power Sister Agnes had instilled. Not with flame, not with knives, with ice and belief. When the ledgers were finally laid out across Sheriff Alan Price's desk, the weight of them made the wood groan. 11 books, each bound in red leather and marked only with a Roman numeral on the spine. They had been recovered from a hidden shelf behind the stone altar in the lowest chamber of the Whitlock House. Their contents were as detailed as they were horrifying. The ledgers spanned from 1851 to 1858. Nearly every child brought into the orphanage was accounted for, each entry written with the precision of a clerk balancing ledgers, not of a caretaker preserving life. Name, estimated age, condition upon arrival, origin, behavior assessments, compliance rating, final status. But it was the column labeled disposition that chilled Price and his team the most. Some entries read, transferred, others, adjusted, many, returned, and dozens more bore a single letter, C. Cross-referencing with the notes scribbled in the margins, the investigators realized what C stood for. Cold room. The cold room wasn't a punishment. It was a designation, a classification. Certain children, those deemed disobedient, defiant, or emotionally unclean, were never intended to be rehabilitated. They were selected, funneled, broken. The process, it seemed, had been honed over time. In the margins of Ledger 4, an entry for a girl named Beatrice, no surname, included the following notation. C3 profile, responds poorly to isolation, recommend accelerated cold exposure, begin Protocol 2 by end of week. What was Protocol 2? That question was answered when one of the investigators found a locked drawer beneath the chapel lectern upstairs. Inside were yellowing papers labeled Program Notes. The header, Whitlock Correctional Sequence, internal use only. There were 3 protocols. Protocol I, orientation, no speech for 48 hours, exposure to Gregorian chants, cold baths at dawn and dusk, daily recitation of stillness brings salvation. Protocol 2, adjustment, restricted movement, reduced rations, isolation in reflection cells, contact with marked children prohibited, forced silence for 7 days. Protocol 3, purification, full cold room immersion, daily exposure reduced to 4 hours of candlelight, physical obedience trials, branding if necessary. Final assessment, retain, return. It was clinical, brutal, structured. It was a system, and Sister Agnes had not acted alone. The deeper investigators dug, the more connections they uncovered. Handwritten letters recovered from beneath the chapel floorboards revealed a network of correspondence with religious officials across 3 states, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York. The letters were coded, but easy enough to break once patterns were identified. Words like shipment meant children. Winter parcels referred to new cold room candidates. Adjustment supply indicated medical sedatives. Retreat homes were sister orphanages running similar programs. One letter, dated July 1856 and addressed to Father M. O'Donnell, Albany, read, "Shipment arrived as promised. 8 units, 3 strong, 2 feral, 1 mute, 2 faded. Recommend immediate placement of the mute into Protocol 2. Please ensure the previous batch has been properly cycled. Reports from Vermont suggest the new grading scale, A through D, may help streamline future selection." Another letter, addressed to Sister Agnes, came from a man identified only as P. "We must remain vigilant. Sympathy is our greatest liability. Your adherence to calibration and method has made Whitlock the most reliable facility. Providence must be earned through suffering. Do not allow noise to spoil your silence. "The seas belong to winter now." That phrase would appear in 3 more letters. "The seas belong to winter now." As if "sea" wasn't just a label, it was a sentence. The implication was now clear. Children marked C weren't merely punished, they were selected to disappear. And the Whitlock House had become a processing site, not a refuge. That's when they discovered the map. It was hidden inside a false panel of the altar, folded carefully, marked in red ink. 5 locations circled in the northeast, 2 in Maine, 1 in Massachusetts, 1 in Vermont, and 1 across the border in Quebec. Each circle bore the same symbol found branded into the bodies of several deceased children, a circle with an X. At the bottom of the map, a key was scribbled in the same looping handwriting as the ledgers: W. E. Whitlock, operational 1851 to 1858. G. Oak Grooming Site, Auburn, ME. R equals Redistribution Facility, Fall River, MA. S equals Storage, Vermont. C. Oak Collection Point, Montreal, QC. Sheriff Price brought the evidence to federal authorities. Days later, letters were dispatched to every location. In most cases, responses were delayed or conveniently vague. Fall River denied involvement but had no orphanage records from before 1860. The Vermont site had burned down in 1859 under mysterious circumstances. The Auburn facility had recently been purchased and renamed, with none of the prior staff traceable. Only Montreal confirmed an address match. But the building there was long abandoned. Still, it was no longer possible to claim that Whitlock was an isolated incident. The language of the system, its procedures, codes, hierarchies, were too well formed to be the invention of a single woman. Whitlock was a node in something larger. The most disturbing find came not from the ledgers or maps, but from a forgotten envelope wedged between the chapel's hymnals. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a contract, signed by Sister Agnes Whitlock and Father Marcus Abner in 1852. The document outlined a partnership. It authorized Sister Agnes to initiate and manage corrective protocols for spiritual deviancy among unsuitable minors. It granted her access to non-public funds and allowed for the discreet reallocation of individuals deemed irredeemable. It was co-signed by a third party, Isaac Penmore, MD, Director, Sacred Sciences Institute, Boston. His name matched the one referenced in the purification letter discovered weeks earlier. Sacred Sciences Institute. The building no longer existed, but newspaper archives from 1854 revealed that it had once been a private research facility focused on faith-based behavioral correction. The institute closed after an investigation into the unethical conditioning of minors, but no charges were ever filed. Everything led back to a system built not on neglect, but design. A machine with gears and levers and policies, a blueprint masked in psalms. It wasn't just that children were hurt, it was that they were processed, categorized, broken down into variables: temperament, obedience, response to pain. The human soul reduced to a data point in a ledger, and behind it all was silence, not from the children, but from the world. Because those in charge had found a perfect formula: pain dressed in piety, horror hidden in hymns, and obedience purchased with frost. The cold room had done its job, but it was only one room. And now, the doors to the others were beginning to open. By March of 1861, the town of Harpswell was no longer just a dot on the Maine coast. It had become a wound. The national newspapers had finally picked up the story. Sensational headlines ran in New York, Boston, even as far south as Baltimore. Children found shackled in chapel basement. Cold as penance, the orphans of Harpswell. church program or punishment mill. But despite the exposure, few were arrested. Fewer still spoke. The church disavowed all knowledge, claiming Sister Agnes Whitlock had gone beyond her vows and acted without ecclesial oversight. Her whereabouts remained unknown. Her order, the First Sisters of St. Agatha, announced their immediate dissolution and sealed all records under canonical authority. Those who attempted to investigate deeper were met with dead ends, denials, and vanished documents. But some stories couldn't be sealed, not the ones whispered in dreams. The surviving children, 26 in total, had been moved to a government hospital in Portland. A team of volunteer caretakers and physicians worked around the clock. But progress was slow. Most of the children had gone years without education, warmth, or meaningful human contact. Some flinched at the sight of a candle. Others wept at the sound of music. Many refused to speak altogether. One boy, age estimated at 10, stared at a blank wall for 6 days before finally muttering his first words, "We shouldn't be warm." Another girl, Emmeline, age 7, refused food unless it was placed in a wooden bowl and left at her feet. But it was child number 19, known only as Grace, who changed everything. Grace was silent for weeks. No name, no expression. Just a pale, hollow stare that unnerved even the most experienced doctors. But one night in early April, a nurse named Margaret Hennigan found her sitting upright, whispering into the dark. At first, Margaret thought Grace was praying, but the girl was speaking Latin, fluently. Margaret wrote the phrases down phonetically and passed them to the attending physician. A Jesuit translator was brought in from Boston. His translation: "It is better to be ice than fire. Fire makes you scream. Ice keeps you quiet." We watched the wall breathe. It didn't blink. She said we were echoes of sinners. Behind the third stone, they buried the warm one. The warm ones rot. The cold ones last. The wall listens. It always has. The phrase, "the wall breathes," was repeated often in Grace's late-night murmurs. Investigators returned to the Whitlock House. This time, they brought tools. They began scanning the walls of the cold room and the adjacent adjustment chamber. One section drew particular attention: a smooth stone surface behind the iron rings, colder than any other part of the basement, even without direct contact with the outside air. A geologist from Bowdoin College was brought in. He tapped the stone, listened. Something about the resonance wasn't right. They drilled. Behind the stone, nearly 2 feet thick, they found another cavity. But this was no room. It was a vertical shaft. Narrow, descending almost 20 feet into the granite. At the bottom, a sealed iron door, circular like the entrance to a furnace. Etched across the door's face were 13 names. They matched no entries in the ledgers, no birth records, no orphanage admissions. But every name ended in the letter D, a designation never mentioned in the known protocols. Underneath, in etched Latin, descenderunt voluntarie, non redirunt. They descended willingly. They did not return. The shaft was too narrow for full entry. A rope and lantern were lowered. The camera's flickering light revealed only the surface of the iron door, and what appeared to be bloodstains in a perfect ring around the threshold. The working theory was that it had been a ritual chamber, perhaps a final phase. Protocol 4? No evidence of its use was documented in the ledgers, but Grace had spoken of it, unprovoked, 2 days before its discovery. When shown a sketch of the door, she nodded once and whispered, "They burned the worm out. That's where it happened." The language didn't make sense to the investigators at first. Burned the worm out. But Grace wasn't the only one. Another survivor, a boy named Josias, age 12, was shown the same sketch. He didn't speak. He merely held up 3 fingers, then pointed down. 3 went in. None came back. Grace later confirmed it. They were the ones who couldn't freeze. More digging revealed yet another horror. On the wall nearest the shaft, behind a crumbling shelf, an inscription was found, carved with a thin blade or sharp nail. She said we could choose, but she only taught us cold. No last names, no records, just children turned into experiments, measured by their ability to not feel. And the shaft, it was welded shut. Investigators agreed not to force it open. Not yet. The risk of collapse was high, but for others, the real reason was simpler. No one wanted to see what lay beyond that door. What mattered now was the system, the reach, the intent. If Whitlock was just one facility, how many others were there? The answer came in a courier envelope, anonymously delivered to Sheriff Price's home. No return address, no note, just a photograph. Black and white, grainy, dated August 1857. It showed Sister Agnes standing with 6 others, 4 men, 2 women, all in plain clothes. Behind them, a building labeled St. Callista's Foundling Home, Rochester. On the back of the photo, written in tight, perfect script, this was never about care, it was about quiet. That phrase, about quiet, would come to define the inquiry. Because what had happened at Whitlock wasn't simply abuse. It wasn't even just systemic neglect. It was designed silence, engineered stillness, obedience through frost, submission through sensory deprivation, not just to keep children controlled, but to erase them entirely. Erase sound, memory, identity, make them hollow. The church's silence became deafening. Investigations stalled. Press inquiries were rejected. Officials resigned. And in Harpswell, fear grew. Fear that the truth had grown too big to bury and too dangerous to fully reveal. Yet, beneath that fear, one truth remained. The wall had been breathing, and the cold wasn't done speaking. By early May of 1861, the Whitlock House stood silent once more. The snow had melted, revealing a hollow skeleton of wood and stone that seemed more ruin than building. The windows stared blankly, most shattered, some bricked up from the inside. The roof, half collapsed, had exposed part of the upper dormitories to the sky. Beds rusted, sheets stiff with mold, pages of psalms fluttering like leaves in the sea wind. But the real storm hadn't passed. Not for the children, not for the town, and not for the investigators who had descended into that basement and come up changed. Sheriff Price, once a man of unshakable resolve, had begun to wither. He hadn't spoken publicly in weeks. He refused all interviews. Deputies found him asleep at his desk most nights, a lantern burning beside the open ledger of corrections. He'd begun marking entries, red for the dead, blue for the vanished, black for the returned. He used more black than any other color. Something about that label haunted him. Returned. Returned from where? To what? The shaft behind the wall had never been opened. But sometimes when the wind blew a certain way, workers claimed to hear a low hum from beneath the stones, like the groan of a ship's hull or the chorus of a distant chant sung through grit teeth. Others claimed it was just wind in the pipes. But there were no pipes in the cold room. Not anymore. One worker, Samuel Veach, quit the restoration project after 3 weeks. He refused to return. When asked why, he said only, "The room's not empty." He'd been assigned to haul rubble from the adjustment chamber, but one night, while gathering debris, he noticed condensation on the walls, fresh, dripping in patterns that didn't follow the lines of the stone, as if something warm had recently passed through. No one believed him. until 2 more workers claimed the same thing. Warmth, not heat. Warmth, localized, in pockets, as though someone had been standing in the room minutes before. That was when they sealed it again. All of it. The cold room, the shaft, even the chapel. Sheriff Price ordered iron bolts on every door and stationed 2 deputies on watch day and night. But it wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep something in. By the end of May, 17 more documents had surfaced. Letters, schedules, and coded reports smuggled by a whistleblower from a nearby convent archive. They revealed that Whitlock had been part of a multi-tiered temperance chain initiated in 1849 by a secret subcommittee of church officials and pseudo-scientific advisors. The chain's goal: eradicate inherited spiritual rebellion in orphaned populations through environmental suppression and isolation therapy. One document bore the heading, "Cleansing Through Climate." It stated that temperature extremes may isolate moral impurities from the soul, and recommended cold exposure not as a punishment, but as a sacrament. Another quote, "The child who does not feel the frost cannot feel the fire. The heart must be neutralized before it can be reformed." It wasn't theology, it was indoctrination through biology. Further entries from the Institute archives confirmed this horrific goal. Children who failed to conform after adjustment were categorized by compliance rating. If they couldn't be molded into obedience, they were reclassified as failed vessels. These were the ones most often sent to the cold room, not for correction, but for quiet erasure. One memo described a disturbing theory: that certain children possessed a preternatural resistance to obedience, a condition the authors called spiritual thermal rejection. These children, the memo suggested, could only be silenced by sustaining internal coldness to the point of spiritual stasis. The implication was clear. They believed obedience could be forced by freezing the will. And they tried, dozens of times, on dozens of children, each one documented, measured, watched, and when they didn't break, they disappeared behind the wall, but not all of them stayed quiet. In June, nurse Margaret Hennigan, who had remained with the children in Portland, noticed a change in Grace. Her muttering stopped. Her silence became deliberate. She no longer flinched at light. She stopped eating unless handed food directly, and when asked about her past, she gave the same answer: "I'm not me anymore." Josias, too, changed. He began drawing. First, crude shapes, circles with X's. Then more detailed images, stone rooms, altars, faces without eyes. In one drawing, he colored the cold room from memory. Every child had black lips, except one. In the corner stood a figure wearing no chains, no rags, no frostbite. Just a robe and blue eyes. Sheriff Price showed the image to Father Llewellyn, who gasped. The face matched a painting he remembered from the convent in Boston. Agnes Whitlock, vowed Sister of Silence, 1843. The portrait had since been removed, but the memory stuck. That same week, a long-lost diary appeared, mailed anonymously to a Harpswell reporter. It belonged to a Sister Helena, who had served with Agnes Whitlock in the early 1850s. The final entry, dated June 1852. She no longer calls them children. She says they are vessels. Some empty, some cracked. She hums as they shiver. I begged her to stop the cold room trials. She said I lacked the stomach for salvation. She keeps saying the same phrase: obedience must be made colder than memory. I think she's building something down there. Something that doesn't sleep. Something that waits. The diary vanished 2 days later, stolen from the reporter's desk during a mysterious fire that consumed his office but left the rest of the building untouched. and still the shaft door remained sealed, but not untouched. In July, the team sent to inspect the seal found that the outer edge of the iron had warped, as if something inside had pressed against it. Not enough to open it, just enough to let them know it was still there. Still waiting. Sheriff Price, by then hollow-eyed and sick with fever, gave a final statement to the local paper. "If you think the frost is gone, you're wrong. It's not weather, it's a method, and I think she made it permanent." He resigned 2 days later. By summer's end, the Whitlock House was placed under federal custody. But the records were classified. The children were scattered into different institutions. The shaft was buried beneath concrete, then flooded with salt water from the nearby shore. The church issued one final statement. "We mourn what was lost. We deny what was said. We bless what remains." But the people of Harpswell knew better. Because when the air turned cold that September, frost appeared on one stone wall first. Always the same one, the one behind the altar. And if you stood still long enough, you could swear. It was breathing. She wasn't on any list, not among the 26 rescued children, not in the ledgers, the protocols, or even the sketches Josias had drawn in his silent frenzy. No one knew she existed until she appeared on the steps of the Harpswell town hall barefoot, pale, and humming a song that no one recognized. A hymn in a minor key, the kind that makes you remember something you never lived. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her dress was white, sleeveless, spotless. Too clean for the muddy October streets. Her feet, red and cracked from cold, left no blood on the steps. She didn't speak at first, just stared, eyes too dark, too still. When the clerk asked her name, she tilted her head and whispered, "Agnes taught me not to lie." The room fell silent. She was taken immediately to the federal housing ward in Portland. But no one could identify her. The name she gave, Clara M., was not found in any state registry, no birth certificate, no missing person report, no relatives. But what disturbed the doctors most was her behavior. She never blinked unless someone was watching. She spoke only at night. She asked for cold water, never warm, and she refused to sleep in a bed. She curled in corners, on stone or tile, arms crossed like the bodies they'd found in the cold room. The staff tried to be gentle. They'd seen trauma before, but Clara was not like the others. She remembered everything. She knew names of staff members from Whitlock that had never been made public. She recited passages from Agnes Whitlock's private journals, entries that had only been discovered weeks earlier. She described the symbols inside the shaft door with perfect detail. When shown a photograph of Sister Agnes, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She smiled. "She showed me the room," Clara said one evening. "The one below the breathing wall. The one they closed too late." They tested her knowledge. Dates, events, even obscure prayers from the Institute's archives. She got every detail right, every one. So they asked her the only question that really mattered. "How did you get out?" She tilted her head and replied, "I wasn't let out, I was sent." That was when things began to change. Security cameras in the housing ward started malfunctioning, cutting to static at 3:17 a.m. every night for 13 seconds. Nurses reported temperature drops in the hallway outside Clara's room, sometimes as low as 5 degrees Celsius, even though no ventilation passed through that wing. A maintenance worker found a circle with an X drawn in chalk under his desk. 2 days later, he quit without explanation. One nurse, Agnes Rollins, began having dreams. The same one. A song playing in reverse. A staircase with no end. A voice behind a wall saying, "Stillness is a womb." She took a leave of absence after waking one morning to find her bedsheets soaked, not in sweat, but in ice water. On November 2nd, Clara went silent. For 4 days, she refused to speak, eat, or move. Doctors feared catatonia. Then, on the 5th night, she stood in the hallway outside the observation room and calmly asked to speak with the sheriff. But Sheriff Alan Price had disappeared a week earlier, gone, without a note. No signs of forced entry in his home. His desk had been cleared. His last known action, requesting a file from federal archives labeled as 3 thermal suppression candidates. That file remains missing. Clara, now aware of his absence, gave the nurses a warning. "He's going back to open the room," she said, "but it won't open for him, not without someone warm." She paused. "I'm still warm, just enough." 2 nights later, the Portland facility was evacuated after a gas line reportedly burst beneath the east wing. No fire, no injuries. But when investigators returned the next morning, Clara's room was empty. The only thing left behind was a single iron ring, identical to the shackles found in the cold room, embedded in the floor where her cot had been. The ring was freezing to the touch. In December, a letter arrived at the Harpswell register. It had no return address. The postmark read Fall River, Massachusetts. Inside was a photograph, black and white, modern, and a note. The photo showed a narrow stone hallway, damp and crumbling. At the end of the hallway, a door, iron, circular, unsealed. The same door that had been buried under concrete and salt water. The caption beneath it was typed, "Warmth opens what frost hides." That same week, in Fall River, residents began reporting strange events around the ruins of St. Joseph's Foundling Home, a long-demolished institution with a grim reputation. Local teenagers claimed to hear children humming from beneath the earth. A construction crew found frost on their equipment, despite unseasonably warm weather. One reported seeing a child in white standing among the debris. No footprints, no voice. Just the same melody Clara had been humming on the steps of Harpswell Town Hall. It wasn't over. It had never been over, because the room had not been a place of containment. It was a gate, a process. The cold wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Designed not to kill, but to preserve. To make the obedient eternal. And now, it was open again. The phrase, found carved behind the altar, previously dismissed as poetic rambling, took on a new shape in the minds of those who read it again. Let them be still, that they may last. Let them be cold, that they may not rot. Let them be chained, that they may not run. Let them be silent, that they may not forget. In the months that followed, reports trickled in from other forgotten orphanages across New England. Rooms bricked up from the inside, walls colder than their surroundings. Children in old photos with blackened feet, and in every location, the same symbol was found. A circle with an X. Somewhere in those old stone corridors, the frost still clings. It waits for warmth, for memory, for obedience, for you. Because once the process begins, it never really ends. It just waits for the next child, the last one, or maybe the first.